So this is the reason that, as Carlo was saying, 2 years before Milei became a president, I decided that I had to destroy this legal architecture, which was the legal architecture which was supporting this political structure. So I started a project in which I decided I was going to review all the laws of Argentina. All the laws of Argentina. And I was going to look at every single law, and I was going to say if the law should stay, if the law should be eliminated, or if the law should be modified. And if it should be modified, I was going to write the modification. So the president that would come to power in Argentina, whoever that person be, maybe he or she would want to implement this reform program, but I was totally certain that if they didn't have the reform program, it would not be implemented. So I did want to put something on the table to implement the reform, because I also think that when you fight against such a strong establishment, you need, to some extent, to use the surprise factor. The fact that you need to attack this established in a way that they wouldn't expect, with a speed that they would never imagine, and that way you can actually break, a little bit like David and Goliath, you know. David used the surprise factor because he knew he couldn't kind of confront his warrior, so you know the story, he threw a stone. So I guess it was a surprise factor, because if not, the other guy would have worn a helmet, correct? So anyway, so there was some surprise factor there. So we started working 2 years before President Millei's arrival to generate this job where we reviewed all the laws of Argentina. And so we ended up with 2 big piles of paper. One was the pile of laws that should be eliminated, and one was the pile of papers that should be modified. I did that with 4 law students of Universidad de San Andrés, where I was teaching at the time, with my assistant from my course of Principle of Economics, which is an economist, and with a constitutional professor of law of the Universidad de San Andrés. And we started reading. You know, I've been in Congress, as Carlos said, so I can feel that I can change a law, okay? I've seen how laws are built, no? So there are 2 things you don't want to know how they're done: the sausages and laws, okay? So well, anyway, so, and it's interesting because the way we did that, we had a budget of zero pesos to do this. And how did we did it? And we did it with, I think, a very interesting methodology that I'll just mention in passing, and then I'll move on, which is that, for example, at some point you reach laws that you have no idea what they are about, okay? Or topics that you're not interested in. For example, I'm not an environmental economist. I'm not interested in those issues, so I had to use someone to help me with the environmental law. So I was asked who can help me with the environmental law. Say, okay, call such a guy. So I called the guy, and then I called the guy and says, Federico was his name, particularly on the environmental issue. So, Federico, can you give me a hand with the environmental laws? I have 40 environmental. Says, oh, yes, I'll send you a paper. So you see our diagnostic about what is the issues with environmental issues in Argentina. I say, oh, send me the paper, but I'll tell you, I'm not going to read it. Says, what do you mean I'm not? No, I'm not going to read it. I'm not interested. Oh, okay, so you want us to do a meeting. So I'll do a meeting. I'll explain to you. I don't do meetings. Okay, you don't do meetings. You don't do a meeting, and you don't want the paper. You want me to send you some bullets with kind of, you want shorter. No, I don't read bullets. So I say, what the hell do you want? I say, I know, what is the problem? I say, well, I mean, we have lots of problems. Okay, give me a problem? Well, the glaciers law. So, for example, in Argentina, we have a law which doesn't allow to have economic activity on a glacier, which is not that's fine. We don't quarrel with that. But the law has an area which is an area surrounding the glacier. It's called a periglacier area, and it's very ill-defined. So ill-defined that maybe you can have a whole province in the periglacier area, and the law says that in the periglacier area, you cannot do, for example, mining. So that basically it's a law that forbids mining in Argentina. And you can imagine, Chile exports $50 billion of copper and minerals, and we have the same mountains, and we export $3 billion. So we need to change the law. So I said, download the law from the internet and just send me the law put it in a Word file and just do with track changes the changes that you would do with the law. That's the only thing I'm interested in. Because that's the only thing that the president can sign. I mean, the president can't do anything with a diagnostic. We're over-diagnostic. We need solutions, not diagnostic, okay? When you, in your companies, when you hire a CEO, he can do a diagnostic or not, but the most important thing for you is what solutions he brings and puts on the table. So I need solutions, not diagnostic. But the interesting thing, when I reached this point in the conversation, 70% of the people disappeared. So they were happy to sell a diagnosis, they were happy to have a meeting to explain what to do, they were happy to send bullets, but they were not happy to sit down and see how you're going to change item C of Article 6 and how it has to be written so that the periglacial area, it's a much more difficult, it's a more chirurgical, it's more precise. There's no, excuse me my French, no bullshit there. You just have to give the right solution. And I mean, some people maybe, they didn't know how to do it, and people were scared of doing it. Some people maybe were good, but they said, look, I can give you a meeting, but I'm not going to work 3 months for you for free. Fair enough. But with this strategy, the good thing is that I could identify the people who were going to help me without myself spending time in sorting it out. You can send me the product, send me the product. You can don't send me the product, next. And with that, with 0 pesos, in 2 years, we finally got this, all the laws in Argentina reviewed. I'll tell you in just a minute what that turned into. But I have to say that I was working this, not for Milei, I was working at this project for Patricia Bullrich, which was one of the presidential candidates which was contesting with Milei. And when Patricia Bullrich loses to Milei, she sends me a WhatsApp the next morning and he says, Federico, don't get discouraged. The project that we've built together will see the light better with Milei than even if I would have won the presidency. Because somehow the status quo had already taken hold of our party, and this is the reason we lost the election. And Milei was coming as an outsider, willing really to do significant changes, okay? So I took my 2 piles of paper with a pile of laws to be eliminated, the pile of paper, and I took it to Javier Milei. We had a meeting that lasted 6 hours, and boy, did he get excited, okay? And he was, I said, no, can't be, you have this, you have that, you have this, okay. And that eventually became one of his first legislative initiatives that I'm going to mention just in a second. But before going there, so basically there's a diagnostic here, which is that you have this power structure, and for Argentina to change, you have to undermine the economic support for this economic structure, which at the end transforms into a political structure. And the idea was to destroy the legal architecture which was supporting that. Just one more thing, just a note so that you understand why I think Milei became president, because why did Argentines suddenly choose something so off the bat, correct? So different, so totally, completely kind of different of anything they've seen before. I tend to think it's associated to the fact that in the 10 years prior to Milei becoming president, 2 million Argentines left. And the people that left were not the old people. It were our sons and daughters. The sons and daughters of the poor, because they had no future in Argentina, 50% poverty rate, 70% poverty rate for kids. It was the sons and daughters of the middle class, whose parents had lived a life that they realized they were not going to live, and the sons and daughters of the rich, because Argentina was not a country which provided the sophistication and for the kind of things that they thought they could do. So we were all seeing our kids live. And as Argentines, we realized that if we didn't do anything very serious, we were going to age. Sorry, I get excited because I have kids which are adolescent, and I don't want to lose. And if we would not do something very drastic in Argentina, we were going to see our kids grow up over Zoom and our grandchildren grow up over the Zoom. And I think so that an Argentine said, we need to change this because we're losing our sons and our daughters. So I think this is the reason why when Javier comes and says, I'm going to undermine this system, people said, this is what we want, and this is how Milei gets elected in 2023. And I think in the, well, you know, a very special character, correct? And I think in the first 2 months, he has 4 dramatic successes. Tremendous successes, and things that we could not even imagine that they were going to happen. The first of those success was that the finance minister, Luis Caputo, in 1 month achieved, and this was mentioned already, achieved a fiscal surplus. So 100 years, Macri, for example, the previous kind of, he spent 4 years trying to reach a fiscal surplus. He never reached a fiscal surplus. He didn't reach a primary fiscal surplus. And Milei, in 1 month, reached a fiscal surplus with a 5% cut in government expenditure. No shit, done. And he has kept this fiscal surplus for the remainder of his presidency. And listen, I've never seen anybody so obsessed with the idea, because he comes with the diagnosis that the conundrums of Argentina come from this fiscal instability, because the fiscal instability breeds inflation, breeds instability, breeds poverty. You cannot grow if you have high inflation. So listen, this is something, I mean, this is something that he'll never concede on this issue. But nobody thought that he was going to get it in 1 month. I myself, you know, it was 6 months later, and I said, look, it already happened. I still can't believe it, okay? The second thing that happened in the first 2 months was that, I don't know how many of you go regularly to Argentina, but if you visited Argentina any time over the last 20 years prior to Milei coming to government, when you go to Buenos Aires, you would have seen that Buenos Aires was total chaos. You had rock blockades, you have manifestations, you could not go from one place to the other. And the reason for that is that the way Argentina implemented its aid, its social aid, was through some intermediaries. So it gave the money to these intermediaries, and these intermediaries distributed the money among the poor. And everybody said, this is crazy. Why should I hire a middleman to do the social transfers instead of giving the money directly to the people? But nobody dared cut the middlemen because they didn't know if you were going to have a revolution in the streets. So here comes Milei with his Minister of Human Capital, which is Sandra Petovelo. Sandra Petovelo. I mean, more Italian than that you can't get. And says, forget it. The money is going directly to the people. And remember, these guys, which were intermediating the social the social aid, forced people once a week to march and protest against the government to convince the government that they had to give them more money to control the people. So it was marches against the government financed with government money through these intermediary guys, okay? And everybody understood that this was happening, but nobody had the guts to say, I sometimes say it's like you had a bomb, blue cable, red cable, and when one you explode, with the other you cut the bomb, and nobody dared to cut any cable. This woman, she cut the cables, and end of the story. And when she basically gave the money to directly, people immediately had a 40% increase in the amount of money that they got, because these intermediaries, they took a cut. And they also recovered 1 day per week, because it was the day that they were forced to march with their kids against the government, and they recovered basically that day back freedom for themselves. And so what it is in Argentina is called los piquetes. I think you had some here in Milan today, these rock blockades, etc. We had that every single day in Argentina, in the most important cities of Argentina, and because we basically took away the money from these intermediaries, these guys disappeared completely. So in 1 month, the piquetes were gone. Today in Argentina, you make a presentation, you mention this, and people stand up and clap, because they were absolutely so fed up after 20 years of being extortionated by these piqueteros. Okay, so that's a tremendous success. The third success, I mentioned 4, the third success is an executive decree that Milei launches on his 10th day, which takes a very significant portion of that work that we had been doing for 2 years and basically generates a sweeping deregulation and reform of the economy. And not only because of the effects of the deregulation, which, for example, it was mentioned, for example, we eliminated rent control, so the price of rentals immediately came down 30%. Or, for example, in the decree, and you also mentioned it as well, in the decree, for example, one of the large media conglomerates in Argentina had convinced the government to forbid satellite internet. Why? Because they were providers of internet services. And you know, Argentina is a very large country, and it's very sparsely populated, so you're not going to throw fiber cable to every single person. The previous government had spent $7 billion in a company to lay out fiber cable. So what did Javier do? He breaks a piece of paper, which is a regulation, which this media corporate had forced or convinced, or I don't know what, put the adjective you want, the government to issue, and immediately you can have access to satellite internet. For example, Starlink started being possible to buy Starlink in Buenos Aires, which was forbidden. And today Starlink has 250,000 customers in Argentina. Anybody in Argentina, anywhere, isolated the person could be, has access to internet. The government spent $0 and pesos to do that. Okay, these are the kind of transformations that you can get done with deregulation. Instead of spending $7 billion, you pay 0. Instead of spending 10 years for people to have internet, you have it in 1 month. And this is the wonders of the market can do. So we did this decree, 7023, which was very famous, and that niece of Gerardo Bongiovanni, which is here, he gave me a T-shirt which says 7023, okay? Anyway, and then the thing that we did 10 days later of the executive decree, we sent to Congress a very large bill which had a tremendous amount of additional deregulations, and that we discussed in Congress for 6 months. It was finally approved on July of 2024. And these 4 things basically say, well, Javier is quite an interesting character, okay? But these guys, they seem to know what they're doing. They seem to have a plan. And it seems that they have prepared themselves for this undertaking, okay? And I think that was kind of marked kind of the beginning of Milei's presidency. And which were the results, which of course were already mentioned, but let me just remind them to you. We brought inflation down from 25%, which is the inflation rate per month that we had when Milei took power. Now inflation is running at between 1.5% and 2% per month, so that's a tremendous success. As I mentioned, we achieved a fiscal surplus, and also here I have a little bit of a tribute to some Italian economists, because when you say I'm going to balance the budget, you can do it 2 ways. You can reduce government expenditure, or you can increase taxes. So there are 2 Italian economists, Francesco Giavassi, who's a professor at Bocconi, we were with him today, and Alberto Alesina, you may have heard the name, a professor at Harvard, which died untimely I think a couple of years ago. They had studied the process of fiscal adjustments in Europe, distinguishing the effect of those adjustments which happen through a reduction in government expenditure from those that happen through an increase in taxes. And what they found is that the reductions in government, the fiscal adjustments which come from a reduction in government expenditure were very expansionary, so were very successful in terms of reigniting growth, whereas the fiscal adjustments, which happened through increase in taxes, were much more recessionary, okay? And President Milei says, look, what the government does is useless anyway, so we're gonna reduce what the government does, and what every peso that the government spent is a peso less that I don't have to tax people, because everything that you spend, someone has to pay for it, in your companies and also in the government. It's not that money comes out of thin air. So if you reduce government expenditure, you reduce taxation. So he reduces government expenditure 5% of GDP, he reduces taxation 5% of GDP, which was the biggest tax that he reduced, the inflation tax, because by reducing the deficit, he's not asking the government, it's not asking the central bank to print the money, which is what generates inflation. So the first thing he reduces is the inflation tax, and this is the reason poverty fell from 57% to 31%, and 12 million people are lifted off poverty in the first year and a half of the administration. So actually, you know what? Cutting government expenditure, I mean, look, we don't have any lessons for anybody, okay? Argentina cannot give a lesson to anybody. We're the worst student, we've been the worst student in the class for 50 years, and now we just started this year and we handed in 5 homeworks, okay? It's not enough, okay? Not enough to lecture anybody, okay? But what's interesting is this idea that the fiscal adjustment can be popular. Because I think if you have a discussion here in Italy, let's reduce government expenditure 5%, they will tell you 2 things. You're going to plunge the economy in a tremendous recession, and you're going to be political dead after doing this. But how can you be politically dead if reducing government expenditure means that you're going to reduce taxes? And if you're going to reduce taxes on the poor, it's going to be tremendously popular. So I think we have to rethink our view about the political effects of fiscal adjustment, and also we have to review our view about the output effects of fiscal adjustment, because, as I mentioned, the work of Alesina and Giavazzi already told us that if you do it through a reduction in government expenditure, it was going to be expansionary. And this is not kind of something that I'm telling you now because it looks okay with the narrative. This is, we used this work when Milei was discussing these policies, okay? And we're saying, no, we're going to do the fiscal. Oh, yeah, remember Alesina and Giavazzi, they used to say this, okay? So, for example, we got, if you take the central administration and state-owned companies, that's 300,000 people. And in this first year and a half, we've reduced around 50,000. So 50,000 out of 300,000. We've had no impact on the quality of the services provided by the state because all these people were doing nothing, okay? So now, but getting rid of those 50,000 people implies a saving of $2 billion, and this is $2 billion of taxes. I don't have to charge people to pay for that. So President Milei says, look, the system was, the politician says, give me your money, I'll spend it. It's going to be good for you, okay? But I'll spend it, okay? And Milei says, you know what? I don't want to spend people's money. Give people's money back to people and let them decide what they're going to spend it, okay? This is the way we think about this, okay? Okay, and as also was mentioned, I mean, the economy kind of grew. If you take December 23 compared to December 24, there was a growth rate of 6%. In the second quarter of this year, the economy was growing at around 8%. Since the middle of the year, it kind of stagnated in that plateau as we were approaching the elections, which always generate some instability. And then, of course, you have the deregulation agenda. Of course, I participate. I'm Minister of State Reform and Deregulation. So what I've told you about is the part on the state reform. Now let me say a little bit about deregulation. I think you mentioned something which I think was very interesting, which is that when we approach deregulation, we don't think of deregulation as simplification. No, no, no. Before thinking about simplifying something, we ask ourselves, should this thing exist or not? So we ask ourselves a more basic question, because remember that most of the regulations are done because of lobby, of special interest, not because you have a benevolent central planner which is thinking about the greater good, okay? So what we like to do is eliminate the regulations just altogether, okay? And imagine, I mean, like all the things that we've done, okay? So I've already mentioned some of the initial. Let me give you some other examples. Some of them are funny, okay? So we can laugh a little bit, okay? So, because the other thing, for example, I do is I ask people, write to me. Write with all how the government is making your life miserable, okay? And I'll see if I can make it less miserable. So I go to a TV show and I say, this is my email, put on the graph my email, and then people write to me. We also set up a website in the ministry, so people can send us things to it. So a guy kind of writes to me and says, Federico, can you help me with my watermelons? What's the problem with your watermelons? You know watermelons? It's andulia. Eh? Anguria. 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 What's the problem with your anguria? They don't taste good. No, it's great. I mean, I'm a big exporter of angurias. The problem is that the government asked me that I have to package the angurias in a very specific way, which is not the way my foreign client wants this guy is packaged. So I go to the Ministry of Agriculture and say, allow me to package my angurias the way my client wants the angurias, not the way you want me to package them, okay? And the guy says, no, look here. It says that you have to package the anguria there. And then he says, look, this is not plutonium. This is not Chernobyl residue. It's just anguria, okay? So what's the problem? Why don't you allow me to package the angurias the way I fucking want to package the angurias, which is not even the way I want it. It's the way my client wants them to be packaged. Sorry, but it's so ridiculous. So, no avail. 10 years I've been fighting these guys, no avail. So the solution I found is that I package the angurias the way the ministry says, and then I move the boat 100 meters. So I'm already left the country, okay? And then I send 60 guys on the boat, we tear the packages, and we repackage, okay? And I'm reading this. This guy is writing to me this on an email, and I read this. I tell my team, look, this has to be true. Because if I were trying to make this story up, I could not imagine this, okay? So I could not imagine this, so this has to be true. So I started researching the issue, and then I realized that the government in Argentina, this is a crazy thing of the military from the 1980s. So the government was telling you how you should package every fruit. There was a guy, you could not start harvesting the fruit if a government official says, oh, now you can start taking out the pears from the tree. So I said, look, so I basically threw everything to the garbage. I told the guy in the food, I said, what should the government do with the fruit? He says, we should do these two things. I basically sent to the garbage bin all the previous regulation. I just put a regulation, which was 2 pages with those 2 things, end of the story. And as far as I know, nothing terrible has happened, okay? But let me tell you another interesting story. So, for example, the navigation code, 800 pages. How you kind of, in order to get a boat to be able to sail and all that, okay? When we finished this with a political science from the security ministry, he says, Federico, I've just realized that macroeconomics is for lazy people. I say, what do you mean macroeconomics is for lazy people? Yeah, because they have only 5, 6 variables. Here, when we did this navigation code, we had to look at 100 things, okay? So certainly macroeconomics is for lazy people. So for example, look at this story. You have a boat. So the government tells you that you have to have a certain electric equipment on the boat. Because if the boat runs out, you have to have like a backup power generator. So I say, look, if you have a boat and you're going to go 4,500 miles into the South Atlantic, and you have a ship which is $200 million, and you're going to put a crew of 100 people in it, I think you have the ability to figure out if you need a backup electricity generator, okay? So why should the government tell you that you should have it? But anyway, imagine that that's okay, and we say, okay, fine. For the boat that goes to the South Atlantic, tell them that they have to have. But then we have in the rivers, we have the Paraná Delta, where the boats are always not more than 10 meters from the coast. And the regulation forced them to have the backup generator, which basically increased the price of the boat, of those small boats, by 40%. So the boat producer says, look, Federico, if I run out of electricity, I throw un cable, I throw a rope. I throw a rope to a guy, say, Cacho, tirame. Okay, and then Cacho me tira, and I get to the coast. Okay, why should you force me to have this equipment which increases the cost of my boat for 40% when I'm 10 meters from the coast? Okay, so those are the kind of absurd things that you have to look, this is the best job in the world because it's so much fun. And also it's a little bit like it's like being a detective because sometimes some of these things, the beauty that they have is that they're hidden. So I'll give you an example. In the wage negotiation of the comercio, the wage negotiation of comercio. So what has happened in Argentina is you have this institute of la convención colectiva. It's the same thing in Italy, convención colectiva? Okay, so the unions get together with the business leaders and they kind of set up, how do you call that? It's a contratazione colectiva. But in Argentina, the contratazione colectiva, over the years, they started putting like small, I don't know if you have this in Italy here, but they started putting like small tolls. Like they agree on the wage and say, oh, but the business are going to pay a 1% contribution to the Chamber of Representatives of the businesses, and the worker is going to pay an extra 1% contribution for cultural activities to the union, okay? And if you ask me, I think those are private taxes. Those are taxes, but they are private. They don't go to the state, because what is a tax? A tax is you impose the obligation of someone to pay something. Okay, so here is a private guys are asking me to pay. So it's private taxes. For example, in the contratazione collettiva de comercio, these taxes, these hidden taxes, but nobody in Argentina knows about this. You know how much money is? $1 billion per year. So all the Argentines are paying $1 billion per year, and our economy is not like the Italians, it's much smaller, correct? $1 billion, an extra cost in these tolls to the chamber, which is representing the business people in the contratazione and the unions. Okay, so and how can you have you're still $1 billion from people and nobody knows about it? Okay, so we're slowly removing. So a few weeks ago we removed $250 million of these tolls that people were saying. I could go on and on. This an amazing amount of. So let me just finish, because I think we want to have a conversation, and I think there are questions. But let me make a few comments on recent events, because I don't know how much you guys are all following Argentina or not. I think that if you are here, some minimal interest, unless Alberto and Carlo dragged you in here, okay? Just to make number, I think probably you have some, I think you just have some interest in Argentina. And we knew that this system was not going to, as I said before, was not going to exit the forum without a splash. And if you would have gone if we go 2 months back in Argentina, the government with all these achievements was heading to a very significant win in the midterm elections here in October. So what started happening is that, of course, when you have to build up the list, you have, there's tension, and you do alliances, you don't do alliances. I mean, a lot of things happen. But then suddenly, particularly the Peronist Party, they decide that they're going to try to undermine as possible the macroeconomic stability of President Milei. So they start convincing other people in Congress to start passing laws which generate a lot of expenditure, and they provide no income source. So it's kind of, we tend to think that it's a little bit childish. It's like the Congress is saying, spend, 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 like a kid, when the kid asks his father or mother, buy me this, buy me this, buy me this. Okay, but what's the cost? Where do I get the money from? Okay. So my son says, I want to see the Formula One in Monza. Okay, fine, find the money for it coming, okay? And the president says, I'm happy to discuss this, but if you want to spend, you have to tell me where the money is coming from. So, for example, last week, one of these candidates in the elections, and he said, oh, we need to spend this, we need to spend this, we need to spend this. Well, when you pile up all the things he said had to be spent, it was 7% of GDP. And what is 7% of GDP? Well, how do you finance 7% of GDP? Well, we have a value-added tax which collects 7% of GDP with a 21% rate. So basically, in order to do it, we will have to move the value-added tax to 42%. Fine, easy. So an adult conversation is, I want to spend all these things, which is 7%, and it entails increasing the value-added tax from 21 to 42%. Fine, we can have that conversation, but the conversation we cannot have is increase the expenditure, 7% of GDP, and what do you want us to finance it with money printing? So which means a tax on the poor, and have, again, 70% or 50% of Argentinians poor, again. So the Congress has started kind of spitting out all these kind of laws. The president has vetoed all of them. We've been sustaining in Congress some of the vetoes. Some of the vetoes we have not been able to sustain, which means the Congress has overruled. Today, for example, we had one law of this sort which the government had to promulgate. Is that right? Is correct? You understand? Promulgate. And then we said we promulgate the law because Congress has passed it, but we're going to implement it only when Congress puts in the budget the resources for this law to be implemented. Okay, so it's kind of a fight. And then we had several district elections, and then we had one in the province of Buenos Aires, which didn't go that well for us. And the day after, the winner of that election went on TV and saying, "Oh, if we come back to government, we're going to default on the debt and we're going to expropriate again." So basically, they were trying to create a certain instability as we headed on to the election. You can definitely not, I mean, Argentina doesn't have a sustainability issue with the debt because it has a fiscal surplus. If you have a fiscal surplus, you're reducing the debt, so you don't have an issue with the debt. So they were trying, I say, to create a liquidity crisis. I mean, they won't be able to roll over the debt, etc. I don't know if you've heard, President Milei basically talked with, well, I don't know if he talked with President Trump, but certainly Secretary Bessent came out with a statement saying that if Argentina were to have an issue with a rollover, this is not an issue, and that they would kind of help with that. Because again, it's not a sustainability issue, it's a liquidity issue. So I think that is something that certainly today, kind of we've got a little bit off the table, and this instability which was created by these statements over the week. So for example, today stocks increased 20% and country risk plummeted, etc. So I'm glad that that's a little bit that happened. What's going to happen after the elections? After the elections, we're going to increase our parliamentary representation because now we're replacing the deputies from 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, we had only 2 members of the Chamber of Representatives. So now we're going to have a huge increase in the amount of members in the Chamber of Representatives. So after the elections in October, we'll be in a situation which will be easy for us to block the vetoes. So if Congress does something which is crazy, the president will veto, and then we'll be able to sustain the veto in Congress, and therefore all these kind of crazy things that Congress is doing will not happen anymore. And the other thing I want to mention is that if, of course, Argentina has some structural reforms pending. For example, we have to implement a labor reform, so that's definitely in the books. After December, of course, we'll be closer to having more a bigger representation in Parliament to push for those reforms. We'll see how far we can get. But the other thing I want to mention is that when you think about my deregulation agenda, most of it doesn't entail changing laws, because most of it entails changing the reglementation law, dispositions, resolutions of lower levels of government, so the deregulation effort can kind of continue unabated. We have a methodology to count how many articles have we, articles where you take a registry, you take out an obligation, you take something that the government has forces you to do. How many of those we've taken out since the beginning of Milei administration? And it's 9,000. Okay, so we've kind of done a lot of deregulation. So I started saying that Argentina is the most stable country because the political structure is stable, but that created this bias for fiscal excesses, which made it on the surface, made it unstable. So now what we have to do is make that political structure unstable, which is the reform and the revolution we're trying to do. We're going to consolidate it in the elections in October. And by making that political structure unstable will allow the economy to be stable. So that's where we are. Thank you.
Es la marcha de